Hello students, and welcome to Chapter 6, Part 2. In this video, we are going to be looking at case studies for several countries around the world. We're going to be looking at the United States, India, China, Nigeria, and Russia. So several of those countries are in this little picture of showing different times projecting into the future of where these countries are headed population-wise. You can see that currently, and this is still the case in 2020, that China is the most populous country on the earth, followed by India. And then the United States, this golden one, is we're like a distant third. So, but by 2030, look and see that India is projected to surpass China. And by 2050, Nigeria is projected to surpass the United States. So and look at how fast Nigeria comes up. So we're going to be looking at several of these countries just to look at different things that are happening to the demographics and population in these countries. So we're going to start with the United States. And the United States is kind of a complex case study because there's a lot of different things that go into our population changes through time. This shows the pretty much exponential looking increase of the United States population with time. And we have this data over here for the census through the most recent year that we have census data, which is 2010. We did just complete our 2020 census, but we don't have that data yet. And it looks pretty exponential, except for this one kink in here. And you notice that happens in the 1930s. And the reason for that slowdown in population growth was probably the Great Depression. So looking at our population growth, you can see currently which states are growing the fastest, and they're those dark colored ones. Arizona's been growing really fast for many years, as has Nevada, mostly due to Las Vegas. And you can see that Washington is in a fairly rapid growth for compared to other states, but not the fastest growth. But that does have an impact on your lives. So total fertility rates in 2017, you can see that countries like the Dakotas have fairly high fertility rates. Other states, you know, a lot of the ones in the South here are not so great. We're kind of middle of the road for fertility rates. Population density, I love looking at the US map because it's just, you could draw a line right down the center of it and you can see how the eastern half of our country is really quite populated, while the western half, with the exception of the West Coast, is really quite empty. And I think it really shocked my son this summer when we drove cross country for him to see just how empty a lot of our American West is. And so the eastern half of our country has been populated for a lot longer than the western half, and we still have a lot. And we have a lot of mountains out here too that would make having a dense population pretty difficult. So what about Washington State? In this year here, in 2013, Seattle was ranked the #1 fastest growing city in the country. So that means that Washington State in general it has a pretty rapid population growth over the last decade or so. And you can see here from 1980 projecting into the future that we're looking at about doubling our population from 1980 out to the year 2030, which is only 10 years away at this point. So what does that kind of population growth do? You're going to be looking at some of this in class with one of your free response questions this year. But generally, when you have a rapidly growing population, it might have an effect on your infrastructure. So as your population grows, you have to make sure that it can put a strain on your infrastructure. You're going to need more buildings, more roads, et cetera, more housing. So because you have a growing population, your housing costs can go up. And as we know, Seattle has a really high housing cost. There's going to be more environmental demand on your resources because, you know, you have a lot more people in the state. And so your natural resources might be put under strain. State revenue, it's usually a good news to have a higher population because you're going to increase your tax base if you have more people in the state. And then state university admission criteria, the more people you have in the state, the more competition there's going to be for those state universities. And another good news piece of item is that your service industry will have a lot of growth. So just in my little area, West Seattle's becoming way more populated, and then we've had a lot of restaurants open up in the last few years, even a few really close to my house, and I don't live in a very urban part of West Seattle. So the fertility in the United States has had, again, some complexities over time. And one of those complexities is the baby boom generation. So the baby boomers were born in the post-Second World War II era. And the ending of the year is 1964. So what happened was post-World War II, things were going really well. The war was over. The men came back home and the United States underwent a great economic boom. And when just like the Great Depression led to a slowdown in population growth, economic booms tend to lead to population increases. So, and you can see down here too that we are also a very ethnically diverse country, that there are different fertility rates for different ethnic groups in our country. So the other thing that makes this rather complicated is that we are a nation of immigrants. And so immigration history through time in our country has really changed the dynamic of who's here and how fast we're growing. So most currently we have decreasing fertility. Our fertility rate's been decreasing this country, but that's been made up by immigration is actually providing a lot of that growth in our country now instead of our fertility rates. So, and in addition to that, the arrival of new immigrants and their children, they count for about 55% of the US population increase from 1965 to 2015. And that's from the Pew Research Center. So with that, we've had increasing levels of both legal and illegal immigration. And this is a very hot button political topic that I'm not going to get into in this lecture, but it's one of those things that whether or not you feel it's a good thing or a bad thing, our immigrants boost our national economy. And also we can bring people in from other countries that, work in our tech industries, et cetera. But on the downside, the more people are going to also consume more resources and things like providing healthcare and services for those people. So there are two sides to the immigration equation. So back to the baby boomers. These are interesting because again, they were the post-World War II era. Most of them now are heading into retirement. So this was where they were in 2012. By 2038, they're going to be in their later 70s. And again, there's both a good side and a bad side to this. As that generation leaves the workforce, there's going to be a great demand for people to replace those boomers in those jobs, but there's also going to be an increased demand for Social Security and Medicaid, or Medicare. So as we look at that, the good news for you guys with the boomer generation going out is that you, as the upcoming generation, as you enter the workforce, there's going to be lots of jobs vacated by those exiting and retiring boomers. So, but on the downside, if you look at the number of people that are going to be senior citizens in our country, because of that large boomer generation, as they all hit senior citizenhood, we're going to have a very large senior citizen population in this country. And the trouble with that is that healthcare in this country, we pay more for our healthcare than just about any other westernized nation out there. As you get older, if you look at this graph of age and cost of healthcare, it goes up no matter which country you live in. As you get older, you're going to have more need for, medicines, hip replacements, just heart, whatever it is, you're just going to have more medical needs as you get older. But in the United States, because we pay so much for our healthcare, that's going to put a burden on our system as we have so many boomers entering that age group. Similarly, Social Security, you pay into it your whole working life. After you retire, you get to withdraw from the Social Security system. And if we have too many people in that retired age group, it can put a strain on that system as well as Medicare. So we're looking at, again, projecting into the future, how much people we're going to have enrolled in Medicare. So our healthcare situation is something that really needs work in our country so that we don't strain as we have all of these people working their way, the boomers going through the senior citizenhood. So the other thing that's really interesting is that we are also, our demographics are changing. So the proportion of white people in the nation is on the downswing. We have been a majority white nation for a very long time. We're looking at by the year 2050, the majority of adolescents, so people coming up, in that pre-reproductive age group, the white people are no longer going to be the majority in the country. So we're going to be a more ethnically diverse country as time goes on. So all of these things make our changing. And as we saw in that first graph, that there's different fertility rates for different ethnic groups. And here's just showing population pyramids projecting year 2010 and then projecting the paler into 2050, what those are going to look like. So again, America is an interesting country to watch for those perspectives. Moving along to India. India, they had also an exploding population, but unlike China, they haven't been able to reduce their population growth as much. And part of that has been just poor planning, inefficiencies in the system. Women have very low status in India. And as we learned in the last lecture, educational attainment and status of women in the workforce, et cetera, lowers fertility rates. And then there's just a lot of poverty and in India too. So the other thing to note, India is also rather complicated in that there's large regional differences. So if you look at the fertility rates in this map down here, you will see that they are much lower in the south than in the north. And you can see that relates also to population density on this graph. So issues with India include things like there's a large gender imbalance because again, boys are preferred for children in that country. And then again, high poverty can lead to high pollution. And And we're going to be learning a little bit more about India. That says see text, and I took the case study out, but we'll be seeing more information about India in a movie we'll be seeing in class. And I think one of the articles we're reading. So a little bit more about India. Their total fertility rate has come down quite a bit, but not as much as China's. And so, still, if you look at it, it's still 2.3, which is a little bit high, but it means that they will be starting to stabilize because it came down from 3.6, which was quite a bit higher in 1991. There is a large urban-rural divide that you kind of saw on that map on the previous slide. And then, so there's differences between where you are if you're living in India. They have large population momentum, which I believe we talked about in the last lecture, which is because they have such a large young generation. 35% of India's population is under 15. Even though their fertility rates have come way down, they're still going to be increasing their population for decades to come. Moving on to China. In China, they instituted the one-child-only policy in 1979 to control their growth. There was a huge famine, and they decided that it was either slow down their population growth rate or have lots of people potentially die of hunger. So China took the really extreme position of putting in this one-child-only policy, and there was a lot of carrots and sticks to encourage people to have only one child. So the rewards were things like better employment opportunities, higher wages, government assistance, and those who didn't, the sticks were things like fines, lack of access to government assistance and jobs. So there were some exceptions to the rule, but it was really pretty strict, and for the most part, the Chinese people followed it. So you can see because of that, because of the one-child-only policy, only having one child, a fertility rate is way less than replacement. China has a strongly negative population pyramid today. So you can see that here, and then looking forward, there looks like they're going to stabilize. They think that the one-child-only policy probably prevented up to 400 million births. By 2030, China's population is expected to reach its maximum, around 1.46 billion, and then start to come back down again, so that by 2050, there'll be only 1.41 billion. And that doesn't sound like a huge change, but remember, you know, since we're talking billions, that's a lot of people. So they are a little bit concerned about how negative their growth has been, that how narrow the base of their pyramid, that they got rid of the policy, the one-child-only policy in 2015, said, hey, it's okay now to have 2 children. And again, they're worried about if there's not enough young people to support the elderly population as they age, you know, through the population pyramid. So the problem is that the culture has really changed, and people in China only have still one child to this day. It really hasn't turned around, and it is unusual. And you think that if you and everyone you know only has one child. When I traveled to China in year 2001, this young lady who was wanting to learn English came to our hotel and was hanging out in the lobby, said, hey, can I talk to you? And we were like, sure. So she sat down with us, and her first question was, what is it like to have siblings? Because she, you know, was probably about 20 years old, and this is the year 2001. None of her friends had siblings. They were all only children. And so that's an effect of that one-child-only policy. So again, they're trying to turn it around now, but China, a lot of couples are still not wanting to have more than one child because children cost a lot of money. So if you're going to have more than one child, they realize that their lifestyle can be maybe better and higher quality of life if they keep their families to just one child. And so the government's having a hard time encouraging people at this point to have 2 children instead of 1. So the other thing that's happened in China, because boys are also the preferred offspring, and that's changing. It became one of the most gender imbalanced countries in the world due to this cultural preference for male offspring. And it peaked, if you look at it, like 2005, at a certain point, they had like 117 boys for every 100 girls. And this can lead to a lot of, you know, difficulties in your society as those children grow up, then there's not going to be enough women to marry the men. And it's just, there's a bunch of negative effects of having a gender imbalance in your society. That has changed though a lot since that peak in 2005. All right, moving along to Nigeria, kind of at the other end of the spectrum, Nigeria has a very, very rapidly growing population. So they have high infant mortality, which we learned in the last lecture, can lead to a high fertility rate. The religions in Nigeria are both ones that encourage large family and no birth control. And so, and then finally, there's also cultural norms that say that large families signal prosperity and importance. So, and low contraceptive use. So we're not going to discuss Nigeria too much right now, but it's going to be one of those countries to watch because, as I said, they look like they're going to surpass the United States population, you know, sometime in the next few decades. And they're a much smaller country than we are and much less wealthy country than we are. So if you have a lot of people and then you get a high unemployment rate, that can lead to things like civil strife, et cetera. So Nigeria is going to be one of those countries you're going to want to watch. Moving along to Russia, and Russia was not on the list of major countries on those first couple of slides, but it is an interesting case study because, again, the reasons for their demographic shifts are different than a lot of nations. Okay, so the collapse of the USSR happened right around this period here. And if you look, a couple things happened right around that time. The birth rates crashed, but also the death rates went up. And if you have crashing birth rates and rising death rates, you're going to suffer a population crash. So they were at 148 million in the 1990s, down to 142 million now, and they look like they're going to shrink another 30 million or so by 2050. So there's this quote from Putin over here that I'll let you read. But if your living situation isn't good, just like during the Great Depression in our country, you're not going to be wanting to have children. So there's also that they have a really funky looking population. This is in 2010, so it's a little out of date. But these great, if you look at the big difference between males and females in Russia, some of this is due to the world wars in that a lot of the men were killed in World War I and World War II. And then the other thing is that the men have a much higher death rate in Russia than the women do. So number one, they have a very low fertility rate. 1.6 is very far below replacement level. And then look at the death rate. It's quite high. And for men, it's much higher than women. The average lifespan of a Russian male is only 59 years old compared to 72 for women. And on top of that, they have a high abortion rate. And this data is a little bit out of date, but that's quite high for an abortion rate. So, and then at the same time, people aren't moving to Russia. So they don't have much in the way of immigration to make up for the loss of their native born population. So what's Russia trying to do? They're trying to give incentives to their people to have more children. And they're not the only country doing this. I think Italy's been doing some of this too, not the same things, but this their government encouraging their population to have more children. They actually gave a day off called the Day of Conception to try to encourage people to make more babies. And public, you can see these kind of public, like, you know, what do you call it? Public information campaigns trying to encourage people to have more children. Look at this lady, looks like she had triplets. Will they work? You know, and again, giving money to people if they have more children. It might, you know, in the 1950s, the US GI Bill is one of the things that fueled the baby boomer generation. So, you know, who knows what's going to be happening with Russia down the road if they'll be able to slow down their shrinking population. Okay, so just, you know, kind of just overview then of all these case study countries. If you look at their population, these are 2016 data. Look at the average age, and you notice that a country like Russia that's shrinking, their average age is older than the other countries. Nigeria has a very young age, and for a lot of our rapidly growing countries, there's a real opportunity for them down the road because they will have fairly young populations versus continents, say in Africa, versus continents like Europe, where the average age is going to be much older. And then again, for the average growth rates, you're going to have a negative growth rate if you're shrinking. All these other countries are still growing. Nigeria, 2.44 is a very high growth rate. You know, and India going to be the next closest. So, and again, if you compare that, that will relate to your fertility rates. If you have a very high fertility rate, this is over 5 children per woman on average, that is what leads into that very high growth rate. So this is just projecting into the future of those 4 case study countries, not including Russia. And again, India looks like it's going to surpass China by before 2030, and Nigeria is going to surpass the United States before 2050. Okay, so just, this is a few more case study countries in here. We're not going to talk about these, but just looking at who's growing and who's shrinking. Russia looking to shrink by 16%. Japan, we're going to be learning more about Japan in a video in class, versus United States still growing. And again, about half of that's due to immigration. And then Nigeria, 176%. That's huge. Okay, so one last case study, and this is about AIDS, and it's starting to become less of a factor now because we're actually doing a lot to combat AIDS in Africa now. But AIDS in Africa really took off in the sub-Saharan nations. And if you look at the number of deaths per 100,000 individuals due to AIDS, it's really quite high in some of those nations. And this had a really devastating effect on their life expectancy. If you look at this pyramid in here, This is what it looks like with the AIDS epidemic. And this is the outer one's 2020. So this inner one's a little bit older data, but this is what it looks like, what it would have been if there had been no AIDS. And this is what is very unusual about this population pyramids. All population pyramids get narrow at the top, but AIDS really took out people in that reproductive area. And that's bad for a few reasons. One, it would not be before they had children. So you still have children in the countries, but these are the people that take care of everyone else. They're the workers that take care of the elderly and the children. So if you look at the death rates by age, the greatest age group that was affected by AIDS and is in that most productive age group, the 15 to 49-year-olds. So the good news is that the life expectancy is rebounding. This was life expectancy in general around the world has gone up over time, but because when the AIDS epidemic hit in the late 80s and through the 90s, it took a dive in some of these African sub-Saharan countries. But with medicines and a lot of education, when I traveled in Africa 5 years ago, there was a lot of public information campaigns around about being safe. And protecting yourself from AIDS. They've seen their life expectancies now rebounding. Okay, so in wrap up, what we're looking at globally is an aging of the global population. So if we break this down, the United States is in this dark stripy green and the world is the brown ones. Overall, we're looking at the age group, the oldest age groups increasing the most worldwide. And for the first time ever, if you look at this bottom graph, the number of older people is going to surpass the number of younger people around, shortly before the year 2030. So that's not so far off now. And again, this is going to have a lot of important economic consequences. So this is just some more comparisons between 2010 and where they're projected to be in 2050 for average age. Look at the average age of a Japanese person is looking to be 53 years old by 2050. United States, we're not shifting as much, but for all these nations, basically they're calling it the graying of the world. And again, we don't want an unbalanced too many old people. You really want to have, for stability, to have pretty much even numbers at all the different age groups. This is just the United States looking at our average age compared to the world. The reason why the world is so much younger is because, again, a lot of the African nations have a still really rapidly growing populations. So the bad thing about having so many older people, again, is the pressure on workers to be able to support not only all the children, but now all the elderly people as well. So the UN does a report every couple of years and puts out what their projections are for the future. And again, you can see that the average age that they're projecting into the future is going to steadily get older, even for your least developed nations, although they're still going to be relatively young nations. LDC stands for least developed. Population over 60 going to increase over time. And part of that's due to this increased life expectancy. And the global fertility rate is going to drop by 2,100 down to just replacement level, and that's for the whole world. So good news, life expectancy increased by 3 years from 2005 to 2015. The impact of AIDS has peaked in the last decade, and then life expectancy, as I mentioned, is on the rebound. And then the infant mortality rate, child under 5 mortality rate dropped quite a bit from 71 per 1,000 down to 50 per 1,000 in 2015. So in 10 years, that's quite a large drop in child mortality rate. All right, so future projections. There's going to be a shift of where most of the people are. Asia's looking at losing people as countries like China and Russia start to shrink. Africa is going to be where most of the growth in population occurs. The Americas look pretty stable, and Europe's going to be losing quite a bit of their population relative to the rest of the world. So again, I'll let you look at the lower graph at your leisure. And then more than half of future growth is expected to be in Africa. The least developed nations are projected to really grow from 1.9 billion in 2050 to 3.2 in 2100. These are showing different projections for population growth. Usually we go with the middle model for the one we think is best. And just a few more statistics, 40% of the world's population lived in countries with a total fertility rate of less than replacement. And then they are dropping worldwide with a slight increase in Europe. So the net migration rate to high income countries was 4.1 million. And then that's going to account because most of these most developed high income countries are not really growing on their own anymore. They think it's going to account for 82% of the growth in these high income countries between 2015 and 2050. All right, so that's the end of the lecture. And we'll make sure you fill out your notes and finish this ed puzzle before you go ahead and stop it.